On a grey stretch of coastline in western Sweden, there is a slab of rock that has been staring up at the sky for close to 3,000 years. Someone knelt over it a very long time ago, and with a harder stone or a point of bronze, began scratching a shape into the surface, one patient groove at a time. When they finished, the shape was a ship, long and narrow, curved at both ends, with a line of tiny human figures standing along its spine like beads on a string. That carving is still there today. It is one image among more than 10,000, just like it, scattered across a region called Bohuslan. And once you know what you are looking at, it stops being a curiosity for archaeology textbooks and starts looking like exactly what it probably was. A record of men who went to war on the water in a world that existed a full 1,000 years before anyone had ever spoken the word Vikings. Bohuslan runs along Sweden's west coast, and its rock faces hold one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric art anywhere on Earth. Archaeologists have catalogued more than 1,500 sites where human and animal figures were carved into open stone, most of them close to what would once have been the shoreline. In recent decades, conservators have started filling the carved lines with red paint so tourists can actually see them, since 3,000 years of wind and rain have worn the grooves down to almost nothing. Plenty of researchers hate this practice, arguing it's an invented modern version of something that was never meant to be read. But whatever you think of the paint, it does something remarkable. It drags these ancient lines back into focus and lets you see, at a glance, the thing the carvers cared about most. It wasn't animals, it wasn't crops, it was boats. Depending on how you count them, there are upwards of 10,000 individual ship images cut into this stretch of coast, more than any other single motif by a wide margin. Alongside the ships are human figures, and a striking number of those figures are holding something sharp. Axes, spears, bows, and swords over and over again. So the obvious question is, what were the people who made these carvings actually trying to say? That question has had a surprisingly turbulent answer. The earliest scholars to take these carvings seriously, back in the 1700s and 1800s, jumped almost immediately to the same conclusion. Warriors, ships, Scandinavia. Of course, this was about the Vikings. It was the only frame of reference anyone had. But by the 1920s, as archaeological dating methods improved, that theory started to fall apart. Radiocarbon analysis and stratigraphy placed the carvings firmly in the Nordic Bronze Age, a period running roughly from 1700 to 500 BCE, a good 2,000 years before any Viking ever set foot on a longship. Once that timeline was locked in, an entirely different interpretation took over. This wasn't history, the thinking went. It was religion. Fertility rites, seasonal ceremonies, appeals to the gods for a good harvest. For most of the 20th century, that was the accepted story, and the more sites that were discovered, the more it seemed to hold. Then, in the last couple of decades, researchers like Johan Ling and Andreas Toreld started pushing back hard. Their argument wasn't that the religious reading was wrong exactly. It was that it was incomplete, and that generations of scholars had quietly written violence out of the story, because a peaceful, ritual-obsessed Bronze Age society was simply a more comfortable thing to imagine. Ling and Toreld's case is that religion, warriors, and warships were tangled together in ways that are genuinely hard to untangle, and that the old peaceful reading only survived because nobody wanted to look too closely at the alternative. Untangling it is hard for some very practical reasons. There are so many individual figures across these panels that an exact count is basically impossible. And carvings weren't made all at once. Someone might cut a figure into a rock face, and years, decades, or centuries later, somebody else could carve a second figure right beside it, with no way for us to know how much time actually separated the two. That means you can't treat a crowded panel as a single frozen moment. It's more like graffiti built up in layers over generations. Still, one thing comes through with total clarity. There is real, unambiguous violence carved into this stone. and it's tied intimately to the ships. The human figures show up in the middle of things, fighting, marching, standing guard, hunting. Many of them are warriors, weighed down with heavy axes, spears, bows and arrows, and shields for protection. But the weapon that shows up most and mattered most was the sword. Something like 4 in every 10 carved figures are shown holding one. In the Bronze Age, owning a sword wasn't just practical, it was a status symbol, a mark that you were somebody. And curiously, most of these carved swords are shown sheathed, hanging quietly at the figure's side. Scholars in the ritual camp have leaned on exactly this detail. Sure, these men are pointing axes and spears at one another, but nobody's actually bleeding, except that one scene blows that argument apart. On one panel, a man is driving a spear into another man's chest with both hands, full force. The man being killed still has a weapon raised, what looks like a simple, heavy wooden club, nothing fancy, nothing status-laden. Compare that to all those other panels full of dignified sword-bearers who never actually connect with each other, and the difference is stark. The plainness of this scene, the complete absence of a prestige weapon, makes it feel less like myth and more like something that actually happened. A real fight that ended in a real death. Not far from it, a group of men face off with at least 6 of them holding swords aloft, poised for a fight that looks like it's about to explode. Sword-bearing figures are scattered everywhere in this stretch of coast. On a separate rock, 2 swordsmen stand near 2 archers, bows drawn, arrows aimed straight at each other. None of this reads as accidental. Taken together, it paints Bohuslan as an unusually violent, unusually bloody valley for its time. Another panel adds to the pile of evidence. A man wearing a sheathed sword is being threatened or attacked by another man carrying a raised spear. And just as that's happening, a third figure steps in, apparently trying to block or stop the attack. Staring at these images, you can't help asking the obvious questions. Did any of this actually happen? Or is this what the carvers hoped would happen, or feared would happen? Was there really a violent, warlike people living in this one valley? Or does this capture a single chaotic period when the whole society was falling apart? Maybe it's the carved memory of one specific real battle. There's probably no way to answer any of that with total certainty. What archaeologists can say is that the sword fight and the killing scene likely date to somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd phases of the early Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1100 BCE, which lines up with the very first appearance of warrior figures anywhere in Scandinavian rock art. Zoom out further though, and it's the later Bronze Age, from about 1100 to 500 BCE, that shows the sharpest spike in scenes of conflict and combat. So none of this can be flattened into a single moment or a single point of view about war and daily life. These carvings were made across an enormous stretch of time. But that one killing scene stands as solid proof that whoever made these images wasn't afraid to depict real, brutal violence when they saw it. There are other conflict scenes scattered across the rock that likely echo actual fights. In several cases, a weapon is held right up against an opponent's body without quite touching it, which might be ritual, or might just be an artistic choice to show the full shape of a weapon clearly. But at least one carving shows a spear driven straight into a body. No ambiguity at all. In that particular image, the spear carrier may have been added next to an existing axe-wielding figure at a later point. An hour later, or a century later, there's simply no way to know. Yet even if the scene wasn't carved in one sitting, it's still striking that a smaller figure is shown driving a spear into the back of a much larger one. In Bronze Age art, relative size usually signaled social rank. So is this myth? Or does it preserve the memory of some ordinary man who struck down a great chief or war leader from behind? The symbolism could run in a dozen directions. The literal meaning is probably lost for good. Whatever these specific scenes mean, there's no reason to think fighting was these people's whole existence. You can't separate these warriors from the world around them because almost every scene of combat or confrontation sits right next to a carved ship. That's why maritime warriors is probably a better label than simply warriors. Which brings us to the boats themselves. Are these carved war canoes some kind of Bronze Age prototype of the Viking longship? Look closely, and there's a genuinely striking resemblance to the Hjortspring boat, an Iron Age vessel built around 300 BCE, except plenty of these rock carvings are 1,000 years older than that boat. That points to an extraordinarily long, unbroken tradition of boat building in Northern Europe. But it's worth being precise here. These were not literal Viking longships. Viking ships were far more advanced, sailed, masted, rigged with rope, built for serious open water crossings. The average boat shown in this rock art carried a crew of somewhere between 7 and 12 people, which gives a pretty clear sense of just how much smaller these vessels really were. Some of the carved boats show two oversized figures standing at the bow and stern in commanding poses, with weapons or objects pointed toward the ordinary crew paddling in the middle. Those larger figures at either end were almost certainly the leaders of these small war bands. And it's worth sitting with that, because it tells us something about how this society was actually organized. Medieval Viking longships, for comparison, could hold around 40 people, and the biggest of them twice that or more. Set against that scale, the gap between the Bronze Age and the Viking Age comes into sharp focus. However similar these boats look on the surface, the two societies were separated by at least 2,000 years. In essence, these Bronze Age vessels were sturdy, well-built dugout canoes designed for maritime expeditions, used for short to medium-distance transport, trade, warfare, and sudden raids. Which raises the obvious question: if most of these images amount to warriors and warships, why bother carving them at all? What was the point? The answer starts to come into focus once you think about what these maritime warriors' lives were actually like. These were men who were simultaneously traders and explorers, living an extremely dangerous double life. They left behind a familiar, rule-bound homeland and sailed out into an unknown, often hostile world. Surviving out there meant constantly negotiating new rules on the fly. The people they met were never entirely safe bets, and the sea itself was more dangerous than any of them. In the boat carvings, crews kneel, some raise weapons or paddles, others blow horns. Before setting out, these maritime warriors likely went through specific initiation rites and religious preparations. Leaving the safety of home and family for the world of the ship and the crew was, quite literally, a passage between two different worlds. That journey demanded what anthropologists would call rites of separation before departure, rites of transition during the voyage, and rites of reincorporation on returning to shore. Before slipping back safely into domestic life, these men needed some kind of spiritual reset. None of this is unique to Bronze Age Scandinavia. Nearly every warrior culture in human history, from the ancient world to the present day, has practiced some version of these transitions before and after combat. Crossing from one world to the other, without any ritual or purification, was considered genuinely dangerous. Imagine dragging the bloody, violent world of the battlefield straight into your own farmhouse, among your own family, with no buffer at all. The risk in that would have felt enormous. And it's exactly that kind of ritual and purification that these carvings seem to preserve. Perhaps carving these rites into the rock of the homeland was a way of reinforcing them, of keeping these warriors spiritually tethered to the shore they left from and hoped to return to safely. This rock art may also have functioned as a kind of storytelling device for these traveling warriors. A place where real events blurred together with myth, magic, and a fair amount of self-mythologizing pride. So what does all this tell us about this ancient society? Were they really a Bronze Age prototype of the Vikings? Does the way they lived actually match that fearsome later image? These people get a lot easier to understand once you look at their surroundings, or more precisely, their seascape rather than their landscape. Archaeological research in the region tells us this was a land of small maritime chiefdoms. And more broadly, we know the Bronze Age was an age of warriors. Skeletal trauma and weapons buried alongside the dead are the clearest proof of that. There's little doubt that a significant part of Bronze Age Scandinavian society was deeply involved in maritime trade, war, and travel, just as much as they were involved in farming and household life. That doesn't mean people here were constantly leaving. Given its strategic maritime position, Bohuslan was likely a meeting point where warriors from Denmark and Norway came to make contact with each other too. In fact, those contacts and connections are arguably the real story here. The interactions themselves are the point. For these societies to function, warriors, traders, and explorers had to keep coming face to face with one another, to negotiate power and relative status, to conduct trade, or to launch sudden raids against each other. This was a maritime crossroads, and it was likely that same strategic position that let copper and tin suppliers from places like Britain funnel their goods into Scandinavia through this exact route throughout the Bronze Age, alongside plenty of other traded materials. So this coastal rock art region may well have functioned as a major arena for distributing metal across southern Scandinavia. But we shouldn't picture these places as noisy port towns full of people haggling over goods all day. Nothing like that existed yet. And it would be just as wrong to imagine this trade and contact as calm and stable all the time. As we've already seen, there's clear evidence of serious hostility and warfare in this region. Swords, spears, and axes dominate the archaeological record from both the early and late Bronze Age. Carved scenes of conflict and battle preparation are a recurring theme throughout this rock art. It's worth remembering that these images don't capture the whole of Nordic Bronze Age society. There are no houses carved anywhere here. In a sense, these scenes represent a deliberate separation from ordinary life. But ships, the warships in particular, clearly carried enormous weight in these societies. In fact, the boats themselves were something like a miniature version of the wider social structure. Building an actual seaworthy vessel, not the carved image but the real thing, took a massive collective effort from a lot of people. And overseeing that whole process were exactly the kind of powerful, larger-than-life leaders we keep seeing carved at the bow and stern. These leaders held real power to organize and command people, both on land and at sea. Sitting right at the junction between the North Sea and the Baltic, this was where the power centers of these chiefdoms took root. Did they row their war canoes to shore in the grey light of dawn and launch quick, brutal raids on neighboring communities? Beach the boats, jump out swinging swords and axes, storm into a settlement and drag off people and goods? Based on everything we know about Bronze Age warfare, the honest answer is probably yes, more or less exactly like that. This struggle for power and dominance may have played out across generations, passed down through bloodlines. Local chiefs likely raided each other on a fairly regular basis. But were they limited to purely local skirmishes? Archaeological evidence suggests they may also have mounted longer-range expeditions, bigger, more organized operations. Centuries later, in the actual Viking Age, it was common for a crew to set out purely to trade, then hit some run of bad luck or bad weather, and turn to raiding to avoid coming home empty-handed. It's entirely plausible the same pattern played out in the Bronze Age. We already know the crews shown in this rock art typically numbered somewhere between 6 and 12. Some researchers think that number actually mirrors the size of a typical Bronze Age household. The smallest known Bronze Age settlements, based on landscape surveys, were roughly that same size. Each of those households would have included elders, servants, and enslaved people, all under the authority of one senior male head of household. So it's plausible that the crew of each boat was made up of household heads from across a community, all answering to whichever leader held the most power and standing. That leader's son or brother may well have served as the boat's second in command. Stitching enough of these small social units together into a larger chiefdom spanning roughly 25 kilometers wouldn't have been especially difficult. A chiefdom of that size might have been built from around 10 smaller units, putting somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people under a single chief's authority. Of those, perhaps 60 to 100 household heads would have doubled as that chief's personal warriors, his swordsmen, axemen, spearmen, and archers. Some of the boats carved into this rock show crews of 20, even 60 men. Are those real vessels or purely mythical, legendary ships? There's no way to be certain, but there's also no reason to underestimate what Bronze Age Scandinavians were capable of building. It's entirely possible they really did construct enormous war canoes for their most powerful chiefs, or chiefs of chiefs, which is really just another word for kings. What we can say with real confidence is this. At least 2,000 years before the Viking Age even began, Scandinavia already had a deep, well-established tradition of seafaring merchants and formidable warriors. The strongest evidence that these prehistoric sailors planted the seeds of the later Viking Age comes from a handful of jaw-dropping archaeological discoveries made in the 21st century. Discoveries about people who seem to rise from nowhere and carve out a reign of terror and plunder stretching from the quiet coastline of Scotland all the way to the Caspian Sea in Russia. Modern archaeology and science have finally started to uncover what actually drove those Viking raids, from the North Atlantic to the vast plains of Russia. While modern Viking enthusiasts dress up for festivals and stage mock battles for fun, scientists across Europe have kept making discoveries that are quietly rewriting everything we thought we knew. Recent research is giving us a genuinely new picture of these people. How, in a brutally unforgiving social world, they planned their raids with real precision, aiming for maximum profit and maximum psychological terror. When Vikings launched their first recorded attack on England, late in the 8th century, the country was in the grip of famine, and old chronicles even claimed dragons had been seen flying through the sky. People at the time took the Vikings' arrival as nothing less than divine punishment. To understand where this aggression actually came from, we have to go back to the island of Saaremaa, off the coast of Estonia. Beneath the surface of a quiet modern landscape, this island was hiding a genuinely dark secret. In 2008, road construction work led a team of archaeologists from Tallinn to a Viking burial site that ended up rewriting the history of Scandinavian raiding. Led by archaeologist Juri Peets, the dig uncovered 2 boat graves holding the remains of more than 40 people. The condition of the remains and the site left researchers in no doubt. This was a mass grave from a serious battle. 2 ships, 40 bodies. That fact alone tells you how brutal and bloody the fighting must have been. The bones carried savage marks of violence. Some hands had been severed clean off. Some skulls were split in 2. It was clearly a fight to the death, and the survivors had clearly buried their dead in a hurry. Osteologist Riley Almey, also based in Tallinn, has spent years analyzing these Saaremaa warriors' bones and the way they died, and her findings paint a genuinely grim picture. Every single skeleton bears the marks of a violent death, often from multiple wounds. Some upper arm bones had been hacked into at least 4 pieces by a bladed weapon. The angle and depth of these wounds tell you just how intense the fighting was. Some of these men may have been attacked from behind, then struck again and again after they'd already fallen. Bone analysis on a handful of them even confirmed that their heads had been completely severed from their bodies. But what really stunned archaeologists wasn't the violence itself. It was what modern radiocarbon dating revealed. When the Tallinn team ran these bones and the organic material buried with them through modern dating technology, the results left them genuinely shocked. This ship and these bodies predate the accepted start of the Viking Age by roughly a century. According to the official record books, the Viking Age's first attacks hadn't happened yet when these men died on this island. They were killed at least 100 years before that. And yet the weapons buried with them, the shape of their boats and everything else found at the site prove beyond doubt that these men came from Scandinavia. Those 40 bodies make one thing clear. Vikings were raiding well beyond their borders, at least a century before historians had previously believed. We can say with confidence these were Scandinavian sailors who met a brutal end on this beach for reasons we'll probably never fully know. The Viking Age was an era of extreme brutality, and whatever battle took place on this Saaremaa beach must have been enormous. Otherwise, there would have been no need to hack 40 seasoned warriors to pieces and bury them like this. Scandinavians weren't only pushing west, though. Archaeological evidence from Russia confirms Vikings were trading, not just raiding, along the great river systems of Eastern Europe from at least the mid-8th century onward. Historians studying early Russian history at St. Petersburg University point out that almost nobody at the time had a clear picture of what was actually happening deep in what would become Russia. What everyone did know was that somewhere near the Caspian Sea, huge quantities of silver coin were being minted and exported across Europe in staggering volumes. The stretch of land along the Volga River, between the Baltic and the Caspian, became the very first territory ever colonized by Scandinavians. At Staraya Ladoga on the Volkhov River, wooden objects carved with runic script, dated using tree ring analysis, prove that Scandinavian traders and warriors had already established dominance in this region long before the word Viking ever appeared in any written record. The very oldest layers at Staraya Ladoga hold Scandinavian material that predates the traditional Viking Age altogether. Old chronicles, sagas, and Scandinavian inscriptions eventually gave a name to these people, a name that stayed unwritten for centuries before their exploits finally made it into the history books. They were the Vikings, bold women and men who left the safety of home behind to explore and to plunder distant lands. From modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and Russia to the remote islands of the North Atlantic and even the coast of North America, they spread both terror and an enormous trading network wherever they went. The long-standing mystery of where the Vikings came from and why they exploded outward with such ferocity is finally starting to come into focus. From the early 7th century, Scandinavian raiders were already active along the Baltic and North Atlantic coasts. By the late 8th century, they had taken the northernmost parts of the British Isles, were raiding heavily across Scotland, and had brutally displaced the native Pictish population from their own land. The ancient standing stones the Picts left behind on Orkney still stand today as silent witnesses to a civilization that vanished. Historians think early contact may have been purely for trade, and the first encounters with the native population of Shetland may have been entirely peaceful. Exactly when and how that relationship curdled into aggression and destruction is something nobody really knows anymore. At the Jarlshof archaeological site in Shetland, you can see very clearly how Vikings took over Pictish homes and began reshaping them for their own use. Sometime in the 8th century, once Norwegian warriors arrived, Pictish culture simply disappeared, almost as if it had been erased. Modern researchers, though, don't think this story is quite as black and white as it looks. Not every Viking was a bloodthirsty pirate. Plenty were ordinary farmers, tending their land, herding livestock, or making the everyday goods people needed. Every layer of that society was tightly bound together. Before they ever struck a wealthy monastery in northern England, they had likely spent decades running hit-and-run raids along the Scottish and Irish coasts, striking fast and vanishing before anyone could respond. But the day they finally hit that particular monastery, they found an amount of gold and treasure beyond anything they could have imagined. And they hadn't come purely for plunder either. Behind the scenes, a much larger and far more dangerous power struggle was already underway, between Charlemagne's vast Christian empire and the last pagan holdouts of Europe, fighting for their very survival. Lindisfarne is a small island cut off from the mainland, fully isolated at high tide. Christian monks had settled there centuries earlier, drawn by its isolation and its atmosphere of quiet spirituality, and the nearby fortress at Bamberg gave them both military protection and religious influence close at hand. Today, the island is a popular spot for tourists, but nobody living there in the summer of 793 could have imagined what was coming on the 8th of June. Describing that day afterward, the historian Alcuin, writing from York, said, in essence, that the blood of God's own priests had stained the church of St. Cuthbert, and that raiders had defiled the most sacred site in all of Britain. At the time, Alcuin himself was actually far away, in Aachen, the capital of the largest empire in Europe, ruled by Christendom's great protector, Charlemagne. While Charlemagne was busy expanding his empire northward, conquering one region after another, his brutal 30-year military campaign to forcibly convert the Saxons had pushed his empire's border right up to the doorstep of pagan Denmark. It's no surprise that Christian chroniclers of the time treated pagan Vikings as their ultimate enemy. But some Norwegian archaeologists have proposed a very different theory, that these terrifying pagan raids may have been a direct response to Christian aggression that came first. Seen through that lens, the raid on Lindisfarne, right in the shadow of Charlemagne's cultural and military expansion, starts to look less like senseless savagery and more like retaliation. Whenever internal political turmoil in Scandinavia or in Europe's great kingdoms opened a door, ordinary Viking raiding tended to escalate into full-blown military campaigns. They struck precisely when their enemies were weakest and when the potential haul was biggest. After Charlemagne's death in 814, a power struggle among his grandsons split his empire into three competing pieces and dragged Europe into a brutal civil war. That Frankish infighting handed the Vikings an incredible opportunity, and there was no chance they were going to let it pass. The great Seine River runs straight from the English Channel into the heart of Paris. Around 841, a Danish raider remembered in the chronicles as Asgeir sailed up that river with barely a dozen ships and fewer than 1,000 men and burned the town of Rouen to the ground. From there, they pushed further upriver to the famous Abbey of Jumièges, took the monks hostage and extracted a massive ransom. They stayed through the winter, wreaking havoc on the surrounding countryside the whole time. 4 years later, in 845, another Viking leader remembered as Ragnar sacked Paris itself. For roughly the next 30 years, this pattern of raiding barely let up. The Vikings mostly avoided head-on clashes with the large Frankish armies, choosing instead to simply be paid off to leave. At times, they even fought as mercenaries for the Franks, taking sides in Frankish civil conflicts against each other. In exchange for that military service, they were granted land near the mouth of the Rhine and in the Netherlands. This history is not purely one of blood and looting. Scandinavians and Franks exchanged more than just sword blows. There was trade, negotiation, and real cultural exchange between them too. Once resistance in France stiffened, Vikings turned their attention toward England instead, which at the time was little more than a patchwork of small, weak, divided kingdoms. In the north of England, the Kingdom of Northumbria stretched from the Scottish border down to the Humber River, and was itself split into two smaller kingdoms that were almost constantly at war with each other. The Midlands belonged to Mercia, while East Anglia and Wessex held the east and west respectively. These fractured, mutually hostile kingdoms initially didn't take the early, small-scale Viking raids very seriously, but their part-time warriors were nowhere near ready to face professional predators like the Vikings. In 865, a massive Viking force known to history as the Great Heathen Army, led by Ivar, Halfdan, Ubba and Guthrum, landed on the coast of East Anglia and would go on to terrorize England for the next 20 years. While Northumbria's two rival kings were distracted by a Christian religious festival, the Vikings seized the city of York on All Saints' Day. One king died in battle. The other, according to the sagas at least, met one of the most notoriously brutal executions attributed to the Vikings, the so-called Blood Eagle. From there, the invaders pushed on, determined to conquer the rest of England. York would remain a Viking capital for nearly a century afterward, but modern archaeology tells a more complicated story than the old chronicles do. Excavations in York's Coppergate district reveal a far more blended society than the traditional narrative suggests. Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian culture intertwined so thoroughly that separating the two is nearly impossible. a Scandinavian comb, a Saxon helmet recovered nearby, ship timber reused in Viking warehouse walls. All of it points to two very different peoples who ended up living side by side, whether they meant to or not. After establishing his grip on northern England, Ivar moved on to Repton, an important religious and political centre in Mercia. In the churchyard there, archaeologists found the remains of roughly 260 people, most of them men, arranged around a central burial. A Saxon coin found at the site dates the burial to around 873, notably the same year Ivar himself is believed to have died. Hundreds of smaller grave markers scattered around the site suggest this was a large Viking military cemetery. That same year, another Viking leader, Halfdan, launched an invasion of Scotland. But before leaving, he left a number of his men behind to settle down and farm the land. The Vikings hadn't come only to destroy, plenty of them came to stay. And however monstrous Christian chroniclers made them out to be, their overall impact on England's rural population was, in practice, fairly limited. England's total population at the time simply wasn't very large, so Viking settlement didn't dramatically upend everyday rural life the way the old stories sometimes imply. Alfred, King of Wessex, was the only Saxon ruler who managed to successfully hold off this Scandinavian onslaught. At the Battle of Ashdown, he defeated a second invading Viking force. Even so, Viking military campaigns continued for roughly another 20 years. Reinforced by Ivar's sons, who had settled in Ireland, the Vikings kept up relentless pressure. Finally, in 878, Guthrum, the last surviving leader of the great heathen army, was defeated by Alfred and forced into a peace agreement that included his conversion to Christianity. That treaty handed over a huge stretch of England to Viking rule, a region that came to be known as the Danelaw. Peace in York, though, didn't hold for long, since other Viking groups arriving from France and Ireland kept joining the fight in the years that followed. Political developments back in Norway and Denmark continued to shape the intensity of raiding in England. Alfred, meanwhile, carried out sweeping military reforms, building a network of fortified towns, forming England's first standing army, and putting in place a more effective tax system that helped secure the loyalty of his own people. Scotland, too, kept coming under Viking attack. In 870, Ivar joined forces with a Viking leader named Olaf to capture Dumbarton Castle, an isolated British stronghold sitting at the very heart of Pictish Scotland. Its residents were enslaved and shipped off to Ireland. Dunnottar Castle, near the Northumbrian border, was raided as well. In the year 900, the Pictish king Donald was killed in battle. The great heathen army itself was long gone by then, but raids from other Viking leaders based in Scotland and Ireland continued regardless. A new political landscape was taking shape across Scotland during this period, one still remembered today through the Pictish tradition of carved standing stones. Meanwhile, the expanding new royal dynasties of Denmark and Norway were pushing out any nobles unwilling to bow to a new king's authority, and those exiles set off to find their fortunes elsewhere. The more plunder they brought home, the more they reinvested in ships and warriors for even bigger raids. In Norway, every valley once had its own petty king, until the ruler of one strategically placed coastal strait used his growing wealth to subdue his rivals one by one. Around 870, Harald Fairhair began the long process of unifying Norway into a single kingdom. Whatever was happening back in the Viking homelands had a direct effect on the scale of raiding abroad, both east and west. The Viking assault on England and Frankish territory wasn't driven purely by greed. There were deep political currents underneath it too. Harald's opponents, who saw no benefit in paying his taxes or serving in his army, were likely the ones most drawn toward raiding and exploring the North Atlantic instead. Norway's hundreds of fjords made for perfect hiding places. And compared to serving some new Danish or Norwegian overlord, raiding the rich coastlines of England or the Frankish Empire, or simply sailing off to distant, empty Iceland, looked a great deal more appealing. Some of these exiles served as mercenaries for Frankish kings and were even invited to help take Frisia, which opened the door to deeper raids along the continental coast. They brought home more than just plunder. They brought home ambitions of ruling as kings in their own right. In 947, political turmoil back in Norway sparked a fresh conflict in England. Eric Bloodaxe, one of Harold Fairhair's sons, was defeated by his own English-educated brother and fled for refuge among the Scandinavian population of York. Northumbria's nobles rose up against their new Saxon king, Edred, and crowned Eric their new ruler at Ripon. Edred responded with brutal force, burning the cathedral and terrifying the rebellious nobles into surrender. Eric was killed in battle during a second attempt to reclaim the throne. Scandinavian society itself was evolving all this time too, shaped as much by its interactions with the outside world as by changes happening within. Swedish Vikings, meanwhile, held near total dominance over the Baltic Sea, operating out of Lake Mälaren and the islands of Gotland and Öland. With their extensive coastlines, both islands made ideal bases for raiding Central and Eastern Europe, and sat conveniently between two enormous trading hubs, Hedeby and Birka. Those market towns overflowed with goods plundered from the eastern plains and stolen from western cities alike. The sheer volume of treasure recovered from hoards on Gotland and Öland, much of it now on display in Stockholm's museums, proves just how profitable this combination of trade and raiding really was. From the very beginning, Vikings sought out the most portable forms of wealth: bronze, silver, and gold. They also traded, or simply stole, furs, walrus, ivory, amber, and enslaved people. Long before their first recorded raids in the West were ever written down, Vikings had already been trading and raiding along the great rivers of Central and Eastern Europe for generations. Silver was the real draw in the East. During the 9th century, millions of Arab silver coins, known as dirhams, were funneled out of the Caspian region and exported across Europe by Scandinavian traders. Back then, there was rarely any clean line between a raider and a merchant. One day, a group might attack a farm or a church and haul off whatever they could carry. The very next day, they might be sitting in a market selling those exact same goods. One such merchant was the Norwegian sailor Other, who described these Viking trade routes in remarkable detail to King Alfred of England. He explained how he sailed from the far north of Norway, around the Arctic Ocean, hunting walrus ivory and sealskin, and he also described the Baltic trade routes running from Scandinavia. Another traveler, Wulfstan, described how Vikings exchanged goods for wealth along those same networks. His journeys stand as further proof of a genuinely vast east-west Viking trading system. One of the places Wulfstan visited was the famous trading town of Trousseau, founded by Scandinavian newcomers on the border between the Baltic peoples and the Slavs. Most of what's been found there is Scandinavian in origin, though pottery made by Western Slavic and Baltic peoples turns up too. Viking warlords came to dominate this Baltic trading hub and turned it into a serious military stronghold, guaranteeing a steady flow of traders and warriors deep into Eastern and Southern Europe. Local craftsmen there worked amber and made combs, swords, jewelry, tools, and weighing scales. Enslaved people were put to work both in production and in the hard labor around the docks. Trading settlements like this one stretched all the way from modern-day Rostock in Germany to the Neva River near St. Petersburg. The Slavic communities living across this wider region tended to live in small villages, farming through slash-and-burn methods passed down over generations. Scandinavian warbands moved into the area and set up fortified outposts, charging local merchants for protection as they passed through. In doing so, Scandinavians built a genuine bridge for trade between East and West. But the single largest export flowing out of Eastern Europe toward the Caspian wasn't silver, or furs, or amber. It was people. By the 10th century, Arab slave markets were full of captives taken from across Eastern Europe. Around the same period that Viking fleets were burning towns like Rouen in the west, A Scandinavian leader named Rurik and his brothers were founding a very different kind of settlement in the east, at Novgorod. According to later chronicles, local Slavic and Finnic tribes had actually invited them in, seeking peace and protection, though modern historians treat that origin story with a healthy dose of skepticism. Archaeological finds at Rurikovo Gorodishche, just upstream from Novgorod, do point to a substantial Scandinavian presence there. What turns up in the Novgorod region isn't purely trade-related either. Much of it is tied to warfare as well. Scandinavian graves in the area hold both weapons and merchants' weighing scales, suggesting the people buried there were warriors and traders at once. Russia's great rivers and lakes became the real center of gravity for this early Scandinavian foothold. Lake Ladoga is still an important waterway today, fed by the Volkhov River, and the Svir River still connects the Caspian and Baltic Seas by water. The axes and swords found at Novgorod and Staraya Ladoga make clear these were more than trading posts. They were serious Viking military bases too. Still, weapons weren't the only thing found in Russia. Ordinary household items and trade tools have turned up in huge numbers too. Russia is a country crisscrossed with rivers, and those rivers served as its main highways, a genuine gift for Scandinavian merchants. Barely 50 years after the raid on Lindisfarne, Vikings had already pushed south through this river network, all the way to the Black Sea. Rurik's successor, Oleg, moved his capital further south along the Dnieper River and took the city of Kiev. In 907, according to legend, he pulled off an extraordinary feat, dragging his ships overland on wheels to bypass Constantinople's sea defenses and launch an attack on the city. In 911, Oleg signed a highly profitable trade agreement with the Byzantines, and Kiev grew into the capital of a powerful new dynasty. In the generations that followed, Scandinavian warriors would go on to serve as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperor himself, the famous Varangian Guard. By this point, roughly half of England and a substantial part of France had come under Viking control. But Viking expansion didn't stop there. Out in the middle of the North Atlantic sits Iceland, a crossing considered among the most dangerous in the entire ocean. Even so, sometime around the 840s, whether by accident or by design, Scandinavians reached the island. Later on, many who opposed Harald Fairhair's increasingly autocratic rule fled there as political refugees. Arriving in Iceland, they found a completely empty, unclaimed land and built an entirely new society from scratch. The owners of the largest farms became the community's chieftain priests, known as the Godar. Several dozen of these Godar gathered every year at the Althing, a general assembly. In many ways, early Viking life is better preserved in Iceland than almost anywhere else. From Iceland, Viking ships pushed even further west across the Atlantic toward Greenland, where they established 2 successful settlements. And from there, around the year 1000, they took their first steps onto the American continent. Long before Columbus, a monk who sailed with the explorer Leif Erikson recorded their arrival at a land they called Vinland. These voyages are described in vivid detail in the Norse sagas, and researchers suspect the Vikings actually crossed the Atlantic far more often than the sagas alone would suggest. Archaeological evidence of a genuine Viking settlement in North America has been confirmed as well. Their American foothold, though, didn't last. Within just a few years, they abandoned it. The onset of the so-called Little Ice Age, beginning around the 13th century, gradually pushed the Greenland settlements toward collapse as well. By then, the age of Viking terror across Europe had already reached its high water mark. The turn of the first millennium was an extraordinarily unstable and bloody period for Europe. More than a century after the Great Heathen Army's original campaigns, fear of Viking raiders had not faded in the slightest. In 2008, excavation work at St. John's College, Oxford, uncovered the remains of around 35 people. Historians almost immediately connected the find to the infamous St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, when the English king ordered the killing of every Dane living in his kingdom. But confirming exactly who these dead men actually were fell to forensic archaeologists. Radiocarbon dating pointed squarely to the year 1002. For final confirmation, scientists analyzed carbon and nitrogen isotopes preserved in the bone collagen, which reveal diet alongside strontium and oxygen isotopes from the tooth enamel, which reveal where someone grew up. The fate of these Oxford skeletons closely mirrored another set of remains found near the coastal town of Weymouth. The strontium isotope results made it clear beyond doubt these men were not natives of southern England. The chemical signature locked in their teeth pointed to a far colder region, unmistakably Scandinavia. Most disturbing of all, the skeletons of these young men, aged somewhere between 16 and 25, carried multiple old healed wounds from bladed weapons. Those scars proved these weren't simple farmers or travelers caught up in a massacre by chance. They were professional mercenaries or raiders, veterans who had already survived plenty of bloody fights before this one killed them. In York's Coppergate district, archaeologists found the skeleton of yet another murdered man buried beneath the street, his bones also carrying multiple blade wounds. Why he was killed so violently is something we'll probably never know. But bones like these keep bringing us back to just how brutal and blood-soaked that era really was. In an age of such extreme violence, local and family ties mattered far more than any broader national identity. Figuring out exactly who someone was back then was a genuinely complicated question. Modern historians like to sort Vikings neatly into categories, Danish, Anglo-Saxon, but the society itself was never that tidy. Were the people labeled Danish actually born in Denmark, or were they second or third generation Scandinavians born and raised in Britain? They may well have followed Danish customs and dressed more like Danes than like their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. Archaeology helps break down the old assumption that Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, Picts and Celts all lived in separate, sealed-off boxes. In reality, these cultures blended together into something far more complicated and rich. People certainly went to war over power and identity, but at the very same time, an enormous exchange of continental goods and culture was quietly running underneath it all. Perhaps the boldest, most far-flung expedition the Vikings ever attempted took place around 1036 to 1041. A leader remembered as Ingvar the Far-Travelled set out from Sweden with a small army of about 1,000 warriors, bound for the farthest edge of the known world to the east. They pushed through Russia and reached as far as present-day Georgia, then under Arab influence and known to them as Sirkland, and may have gone as far as crossing the Caspian to reach Tashkent itself. Of that entire fleet, only a single ship ever made it home. 26 runestones scattered across Sweden still carry the memory of the men who sailed with Ingvar. One of them, standing on the grounds of Gripsholm Palace by Lake Mälaren, tells a story that's both heartbreaking and heroic. It was raised by a mother in memory of her son Harold, Ingvar's own brother, and it describes how the two of them journeyed boldly in search of gold, fed the eagles of the east along the way, a poetic way of saying they died gloriously in battle, and ultimately died far to the south, in Sirkland. Ingvar likely came from a noble line, part of an international Viking elite still fighting and dying in the distant east, some 2.5 centuries after Lindisfarne first burned. The most persistent myth about the Vikings is that they were nothing more than bloodthirsty thieves and pirates, unstoppable in battle and utterly fearless of death. The real truth is a lot less dramatic. They weren't meaningfully better or worse than the other peoples of their time. They simply lived through an extraordinarily violent age and adapted the best strategies they could to survive it. The turn of the millennium marked a genuine turning point in their story. The earliest era of pure raiding was drawing to a close, and Viking expansion had reached about as far as it ever would. But more than a century of continued bloodshed still lay ahead. The age of freely roaming, independent Viking chieftains was fading, replaced by powerful, centralized Viking overlords. This new generation of kings had learned statecraft directly from the enemies they'd spent generations fighting, and they built large, professional mercenary armies capable of shaking the foundations of England and other kingdoms across Europe. This long, bloody journey actually began far earlier than any of that, back in the Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago. The carved war canoes and sword-bearing figures on the rocks of Bohuslan were history's original Vikings, the ones who first planted deep in Scandinavian blood the seeds of conquering the sea and never backing down from a fight. Following the trail those prehistoric raiders first cut, the medieval Vikings went on to redraw the map of Europe, building state structures whose legacy still shapes the modern world today. Those ancient lines carved into stone were never just old pictures. They were the birthplace of one of the most formidable maritime empires in the whole of human history.